Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 5. This chapter is entitled, The World Provides Stephen with Amusement. Stephen was amused to hear his spiritual sons so enthused over his Carta Caritatis, but he felt very much as Hugh had felt. He wanted to know why he hadn't thought of all these simple solutions before. Nevertheless, when the abbots unanimously accepted it, he made a move very reminiscent of Alberic. He took his carta, bound it with the Instituta, drawn up by the old silver lance, joined to these the Parvum Exordium, a short history of the founding of Citeaux, and sent this threefold volume to the Pope. The rationalists had argued thus: my abbots have approved the charter and accepted it as the fundamental institute of the order, but in the last analysis that is only a private agreement, entered into by independent individuals. What is to prevent an abbot in later years from saying, I was not a party to such an agreement? There is nothing. But if I can get papal approval of the charter and ecclesiastical sanction of the order, my worries are over. Calixtus II was at Saulieu at the moment. He was the son of a Burgundian count, and Stephen felt sure that the lines in the exordium would awaken echoes of Citeaux's woods in the mind of the pontiff. He waited and prayed. Then, for a Christmas present, he received a bull dated this 23rd day of December, 1119, the first year of our pontificate. It gave unconditional approbation to all three works that were in the volume, but more. It gave papal recognition and ecclesiastical sanction to the greatest work, the Order of Citeaux. The Christ child, through his visible representative on earth, had presented Stephen with the one present he longed for. In turn, Stephen offered to the infant the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that was the Order of Citeaux. It was perhaps the happiest Christmas Stephen had ever spent. March, which had come in like a lion, had not yet shed his mane for the fleece of the lamb before the abbot began to laugh at the world and chuckled at himself. The world was puzzled and somewhat bewildered. It could not understand what was taking place. Not only in Burgundy, but all France seemed to be drifting toward Citeaux or one of her daughter houses. Stephen laughed at the world's perplexity. He could have solved it by telling the world that an old soldier had planned a wheel with Citeaux as its hub, that he had insisted that the wheel spokes be placed in such a position that they drew even as they radiated. The world would have understood. For Citeaux was now a grandmother. Her daughters had so grown that they had children of their own. Indeed, Gaudry's tactics were telling. Stephen's laugh at himself, however, was not so filled with amusement, for he saw that he had not yet solved all of the problems heaven had presented him. Just as Hugh had pointed out one deficiency in his original plan, he himself now saw one in the plan he had thought completed. Stephen knew something of the convolutions of the human brain. He felt sure that someday, somewhere, someone would come along and begin to distinguish and subdistinguish the various lines and even the various phrases and words in his charter of charity. It had been done with St. Benedict's rule. And look at the confusion that resulted. He must plan a preventative. He must devise some method to keep future generations from saying, this is not the way Citeaux interpreted it. That is not the way it was done in the old days. That is not what our fathers meant. He went to his desk, bent over it, and stayed at the task until he could say it is finished. The idea had come to him that the only remedy, the only preventative, would be a book of usages, in which, with extreme exactness, every custom of Citeaux would be stated. It was a trying work, for there were many customs. It was a time-consuming work, for it demanded great precision. But Stephen did not scruple about the time, for he knew he was preserving an order. The years went by, until one day he sat back from his desk with an emphatic and expressive, there, it is done. It will take real mental magic to deny or distinguish any one of those lines. At last, I think the problem is solved. And it was. With the final punctuation point to his Book of Usages, Stephen actually completed the rebellion that had begun almost a century before. In 1033, Robert, a boy of 15, fresh from Troyes, heard an aging abbot ask, "What would Benedict say?" That sentence had served as a flint from which to strike the spark that would one day light all Europe. But it was a very slow mounting fire, for it was only now, almost 100 years later, that Benedict could ask the same question and answer it with, "Benedict would say it is perfect." Year after year, a steady and ever-swelling stream of knights and nobles, vassals and serfs went to Citeaux and her daughter houses. Burgundy soon ceased to be the only province inland with her white monks. Before long, France was not the only country in the world that could boast of her silent Cistercians, for Italy had her foundations, and Hugh of Macon at Pontigny became father immediate to many German daughters. The entire continent was becoming conscious of Citeaux. With something like a touch of nostalgia, Stephen saw his sons cross the seas and settle in his native England. Finally, in 1132, the Pyrenees were crossed and Spanish hidalgos were set seeking heaven the Cistercian way of being gallant to God. The world was not only puzzled, she was somewhat angry. Only a short 20 years had passed since she predicted the slow death of the abbey in the swamp. Now she found the Citeaux overshadowing congregations that were centuries old. The Citeaux that Stephen had feared might be a haunted house with a crowded cemetery had suddenly sprung to life, burst its swaddling bands, and spread out to 75 different places. In 1132, Stephen surprised the world again. He founded the first Cistercian monastery for nuns. People had said the Cistercian regime was too strenuous for men. Stephen showed what he thought of the world's opinion by giving the identical regime to women. It was at Tarbes, near Dijon, that he opened the first house. And the women outdid the men. Their houses multiplied faster and they went further. Small wonder the world was shocked and bewildered. Ladies and lords, knights and highborn maids, servant girls, serfs, all of these flocked to this austere mode of living. Europe could not believe its eyes. Stephen thought again and again of how right Alberic had been. There is a secret spot in the soul of every man and woman, which, once touched, makes each one more than man or woman. He himself, too, had been right in thinking that men and women love a challenge, that they love to do the daring, difficult, different thing. And old brave Robert had been right. Stars do come out after dark. He thanked God again and again, but in his deepest prayer he saw that Christ had been most right. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all things to myself. That was the real explanation for this extraordinary drift toward Citeaux and the Cistercians. Christ was calling. His voice was irresistible. Citeaux had found her place in the mystical body of Christ. In late August, just as summer began to droop, an aged monk made his way to Citeaux and asked to see Stephen Harding. When asked his name, the old man smiled and said, "Tell him it's his fellow pilgrim. He'll understand." And Stephen did understand. With more energy than he had shown in months, he groped his way to the door. His eyes had gone dim. As he took his friend's arm and slowly led him to a chair, he said, "We have almost reached our journey's end. Come in, Peter, and tell me how goes the road." "I have come to learn the road," replied the smiling Cluniac. "There's something magical about Citeaux. I must learn it. Tell me what it is, Stephen." The two friends sat then and looked at each other. Stephen was the first to smile and say, "We are withered, Peter. We are two yellowed leaves, slowly shriveling in the sun of life's late autumn." "I know it," replied Peter, "and I marvel at the fact, for spring seemed only yesterday. What happened to our summer?" "Mine went draining swamps," laughed Stephen. "Yours went singing the praises of God." "Yours went digging deep foundations for a structure whose height no one yet dares guess. What happened, Stephen, and what is yet to happen?" "Don't ask me riddles, Peter," said the old abbot as he shook his head. "My weary old brain won't work on them. Years and years ago I told you that I felt that Citeaux's mission was to shock the world. I told you then that I felt it was the work of God more than the work of man. I think that you will now admit that she has shocked the world." Peter's old face wrinkled and his eyes danced as he shook with laughter. "Ah, the old fire still flames. Good for you, Stephen. But come now, let me in on the secret. How do you do it? Show me the mold in which you cast your men." Hours then went by in wide-ranging conversation. Bernard, who is now recognized as the voice of Christendom, was a fertile source for comment. He had made kings tremble, sustained popes, swayed whole nations, and was now dominating Europe. His Abbey of Clairvaux was outdoing Citeaux in the number of new foundations. Such a topic was dear to the heart of old Stephen, and there were other topics, just as dear but not so comforting. Peter talked of the papacy, an ache to the aged abbot's heart. At the moment, Christendom was almost split in schism because of the rival claims of two men for the chair of Peter. Anacletus and Innocent both called themselves Pope. Bernard had declared for Innocent and had won France, Germany, England, and parts of Italy to his side. But Peter de Leon was stubborn, and the battle still went on. Stephen ached for his boy Bernard, who was in the thick of the fight, but he ached even more for the Church of Christ. But Peter was ever coming back to the same topic, the wonder of Citeaux. When, for the 6th or 7th time, Peter asked, "What's the secret?" Stephen said, "I'll tell you if you'll tell me what's wrong with the world." "Greed," replied Peter with conviction. Stephen shook his head. "Not deep enough, Peter. You're explaining much, but not all. Nobles are greedy. That explains quarrels with the church, quarrels with other states, quarrels with themselves." "It explains everything," said Peter with warmth. "We wouldn't have near schism if Peter de Leon and his faction were not greedy for power. We wouldn't have this constant struggle between princes and prelates if kings and emperors and all under them weren't greedy for the wealth they say lies in the estates of the church. We wouldn't have scandals if lords, knights, and ladies weren't greedy for pleasure. We wouldn't have a lot of things if greed was not right in the very makeup of man. Indeed, Stephen, you can bring most of our troubles right down to greediness." The abbot nodded. "True, Peter, but when the tower topples, don't look to the walls, look to the foundations. When the flower is puny, don't examine the leaves, examine the roots. When the fruit of a tree is bad, don't blame the blossoms or the bark, look under the soil." "What's deeper than greed?" asked Peter. "It's in the very marrow of the bone." "Perhaps it is, but there is something that produces that marrow. For instance, Peter, we have heard much about feudal lords and feudal barons, about feudal icings and feudal emperors, haven't we? We have been told that lay investiture has been the result of the greed of these men. That's not the ultimate cause, no. The ultimate cause is not the feudal sovereigns, it is the feudal system." "How?" questioned Peter. "If bishops and abbots were not themselves temporal lords with vast estates and many vassals, the temporal sovereigns would never bother them. You can't imagine the Duke of Burgundy or the King of France becoming interested in little Citeaux or Citeaux's abbot, can you?" "No." Why? We're poor. Our estate is small. We have no vassals. So neither men nor money is to be had from the swamplands. Therefore, we are left alone. But if you keep on growing, if we keep to our ideal of simplicity, poverty, solitude, we'll never be bothered. The houses may multiply and the order become powerful, but no individual abbey will ever be the envy of any temporal lord. But the point I make is that there is always something deeper than what appears. It would seem that lay investiture were the result of feudal sovereigns. It is not. It is the result of the feudal system. So too with the world. It would seem that her troubles come from greed, from lust, from selfishness, from sin. But the root of all her troubles is lack of faith. But Stephen, they are calling this the age of faith. I know they are, and it amuses me. One look at the history of the papacy for the past century will tell you how well the age is named. If the Italian counts and the Italian people had faith, do you think they could riot and revolt the way they have at every papal election for the past 100 years? If the German emperors had faith, do you think they could set up anti-popes the way they have and handle the chair of Peter as if it were a prince's bauble? If our French kings had faith, do you think we would have had the matrimonial scandals that have shamed us and our rulers for years and years? The truth is, Peter, that the people do not believe what they profess to believe. Peter realized that Stephen was right. The trouble with the age was not what so many had been decrying. It was not avarice, not ambition, not mad hunger for glory. The trouble lay deeper. Stephen had touched bottom when he touched of the lack of faith. Thoughts were tumbling through Peter's mind in frightening fashion. The abbot's last phrase, "People do not believe what they profess to believe," had him examining his own conscience. Did he believe with a telling, throbbing, productive belief that he was in the service of God? When he sang his office, did he really believe that he was singing as the angels sang, directly into the face of God? When he received Holy Communion? But before the questions became too disturbing, Stephen interrupted. People do not believe the first commandment, Peter, and that is why Citeaux is shocking the world. She does. What do you mean? I mean that we are living the tremendous truth that people treat so triflingly. God made us to adore, Peter. That is humanity's prime function. Adoration is in our blood, our bone, our deepest being. Just as flame naturally leaps up, so do our souls surge to adore. The abbot grew intense. Why did God make me, Peter, or you, or those thousands and hundreds of thousands out there beyond our woods? Why? To adore him. Oh, Peter, believe me, that first commandment is first. We must adore God. The prime purpose of creation is to give glory to God, and what an opportunity is given to monks to fulfill that prime purpose. The world does not yet know just what it is about Citeaux that amazes her. It's the austerity, the penance, the utter otherworldliness, put in Peter. It is not. What amazes her is Citeaux's burning sincerity. Here men are living the belief they profess. They are keeping the first commandment first. Penance, austerity, otherworldliness? Look deeper, man. But your labor, your fast, your extreme poverty. The rind, said Stephen. Only the rind. The pulp, the edible part of the fruit, is beneath all that. You want the secret of Citeaux? Well, I'll give it to you. The bleeding hearts of the two broken-hearted lovers of the world are our secret, the hearts of Jesus and Mary. That is the whole secret of Citeaux, Peter. Cistercians are lovers. We all know Jesus and Mary. We all know their love. But how is it that you take worldlings, nobles, knights, lords, and serfs, and make them lovers of Christ? That's the puzzle. You make those truths true. Now that is magic. What wand do you use? "Come," said Stephen, as he laboriously lifted himself from his chair. "Come with me and I'll show you." Slowly the two old men went along the corridors. When they reached the church, Stephen pointed up to the life-size crucifix. It was plain wood, with a bloody, bruised, horribly beaten Christ painted on it. "There," said the old abbot breathlessly, "there is my magic wand. If the wood of the cross won't change men, nothing will. Christ took all that, all those blows, all that blood, those nails, those thorns, the spittle, all for me. He loved me." Stephen sank to his knees. Peter knelt down beside him. The abbot was weeping. For quite some time the two old men knelt in prayer. Stephen was the first to move. By grasping the cross, he was able to raise himself, and when he looked up at the bleeding figure so realistically painted on the wood, Peter saw a light in his eyes that he had never seen on earth before. It was ecstasy. Silently then the abbot led him to the sacristy, and drawing forth the brass censer, he stretched it out on the vesting table. Pointing to it, he quietly said, "There is my mold." Peter frowned. "Mold?" he repeated. I don't understand." "Think, Peter, think. The first commandment. We Cistercians are adorers. We take our lives as so much aromatic incense and fling them with reckless hands into love's brazier. We want to burn out in the presence of the two I told you about, the broken hearts. We want perfumed clouds of white adoration to ascend unceasingly before the throne of God. That's why we have locked ourselves behind monastery walls. That is why we came to this swampland. We came to adore. You asked to see my mold. There it is. Into it I try to cast every soul that comes under my care, for I am convinced that the first thing should be first." Then he looked at Peter intently and said more slowly, "Peter, I am convinced that a monk is one who should lie prostrate endlessly before the majesty of God, worshipping him with all his might." The two old friends groped their way back to the abbot's room. When they were seated, Stephen smiled and said, "You asked for the secret of Citeaux." "I think you have shown it to me," said Peter slowly. "No," replied Stephen with a shake of his head, "I have not. For the secret of Citeaux is that she has no secret. And I say hers is an open secret. It is there for all the world to read. It is evident even in the position of your church. Stephen, you used a barbarous word with me once. You spoke of being God-orientated. Well, that's the secret of Citeaux. Even your church is facing due east. You've got your face to the sun. And if you'll allow me to play on words, you've got your face to the Son of God. I see now why Cistercians are so little self-conscious and so utterly unconscious of the world. They are entirely Christ-conscious, totally God-conscious. That's the reason. I'll now allow you your barbarous word and congratulate you on your achievement of all that the word connotes. Citeaux is completely God-orientated." Stephen nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said softly. "Tell that secret to everyone you meet, won't you, Peter? God wants to look on faces that are lifted to his Son." The friends parted next day. It was their last meeting on earth.